Absolutely.
All right,
So,
so I think it's recording now.
yes.
And you have to allow sharing's not turned on. You can request the host. So if you want to make me co-host or allow me to share.
Okay, let's do that. Uh, Make co-host. There you go. Your co-host.
All right. All right, all screen. All right, so is that showing up, the PowerPoint
Yep,
slides?
we see that. Maybe, yeah, that's big enough as well. That's great.
Perfect. Okay, so this is going to be part three of our Shroud of Turin series. And as you recall, when I first taught you guys, I said there's two main aspects to studying the Shroud. So the first is asking the question, is the Shroud authentic with respect to can we prove the images are miraculous? And that's where we looked for the last 2 weeks at the scientific evidence and trying to decide how the Shroud images themselves were formed. Um, this week, I want to switch gears and look at the historical question. So, is the shroud historically authentic? Can we trace the shroud back beyond or prior to the medieval period, maybe even back to the first century, and link it with the historical Jesus himself? So that's what we're going to be focusing on today in today's lecture. So let's start at the one end here. Here's what we know already: the Shroud's medieval history. So if you remember, I mentioned to you that even all Shroud skeptics will admit that the Shroud, at the very latest, dates to around the 1350s, around 1355, 1356 in France. And the first owner was a guy named Geoffrey the First de Charny. And on this front, both pro Shroud and Shroud skeptics will admit that this history of the Shroud is true and it's uncontroversial. Apart from a few, a couple conspiracy theorists and something. Okay, Victor. Oops. Sorry, my mouse is
Yeah,
delayed.
I got him
Um,
in. Don't worry, I'll let the people in, okay?
Okay, sounds good. And in terms of the evidence for that, so we actually have several historical documents. They date to the late 1300s, around between 1389 to 1390. And we also have archaeological proof for this from what's called the Pilgrim's Medallion. So here's the Pilgrim's Medallion. It shows the frontal and backside images, as well as representing the herringbone weave of the cloth itself. So this is kind of why everyone, even the Shroud skeptics, will admit, yeah, it dates to the mid 1300s, no matter what. Now, the question comes, but can we get it back earlier than what the Shroud skeptics will allow? Because obviously, on the pro Shroud side, we want to get this all the way back to the time of Jesus. So, the first thing I just want to say is that in terms of the Shroud originating in the 1350s, according to medieval art historians, that just doesn't work. It's not comparable. And that's even according to a non-Christian. This guy is an agnostic, but he's a qualified medieval art historian named Dr. Thomas de Westlow. And I just want to show a short 5-minute clip. I've learned my lesson from last week. There's no long clips. This one will just be a 5-minute clip. So let me play that. And Suli, if you want to let Doreen in. All right. So this is medieval art historian Dr. Thomas de Westlow on why the shroud doesn't fit a 1350 artwork date.
As an art historian, I study imagery from the 13th and 14th century, like the picture you see on the right. Now, if the shroud is a medieval image dating from around this period, art historians like me ought to be able to look at it and study it and tell you who painted it, how they painted it, where it was painted, and so on. But we can't. And the reason is it's not like any medieval image. Here's one obvious problem. The image you see on the left is the image on the shroud. This is the cloth image. I'm just showing the facial area. Now, it's a very sort of mysterious mask, but it contains an extraordinary secret. Because when you photograph it, and this was done for the first time at the end of the 19th century, you discover that tonally reversed, that odd mask, which is all people would have seen in the Middle Ages, it contains this extraordinary, astonishingly realistic, positive image. It's amazingly realistic, like a photo. Now, this would have been completely beyond anyone painting in the 14th century. I show you on the right, this wonderful painting by Simone Martini. It's an artist I've studied. And it shows you how people were painting the face of Christ in the 14th century. Very obviously stylized. You can see the brush strokes, you can see the outlines. Unlike the Shroud image, which is basically just like a modern photo. But here's a second reason why that image on the Shroud can't be a medieval image. No one in the Middle Ages knew about negative images. No one knew about negative images until the discovery of photography in the 19th century. And no one in the Middle Ages would have wasted their time, even if they could have done, producing an image like you see on the left, that you could only appreciate if you photographed it, and then you could see the true quality of the image, the amazing figure in the middle. So, in my view, it just doesn't make sense as a medieval image. There's another reason as well, and that's that the image is vanishingly faint. It's so faint that if you get closer than about 6 feet away,
getting rid of mosquitoes has never been easier thanks to this.
Sorry, guys.
This simple but brilliant trick you can do tonight to eliminate all mosquitoes around you is taking Canada by storm. A genius student from Toronto is disrupting the billion-dollar pest control industry in Canada with a device that eliminates mosquitoes from any environment in record time. Daniel, a 24-year-old molecular biology and bioengineering student, came down with an unusual allergy.
My
For
mouse,
most
Are you
people,
able to skip this?
mosquito bites cause itch swelling.
my mouse is just delayed, so.
the cloth, you can't actually see it. So no one could have produced an image they couldn't even see when they were making it. From an art historian's point of view, there's another reason to doubt that this could be a medieval work of art. If you wanted to fake a holy shroud in the Middle Ages, you didn't need to create a forgery so brilliant that scholars like me and scientists working in the 21st century would be fooled by it. All you needed to do was to paint one. And what I've got on the right of the screen there is the Holy Shroud of Besançon. Well, it's actually an accurate copy of it because it was destroyed in the French Revolution. Now, this was very obviously just a medieval painting. You can see how stylized it is. But until it was destroyed, this shroud was thought to be an authentic relic of Christ's burial. This image was thought to be a miraculous imprint. So you didn't need to forge the perfect forgery in the Middle Ages. People were gullible in those days, especially when it came to religious relics. In short, the idea that the shroud is a medieval work of art is simply untenable. It doesn't look like a medieval work of art, it's not made like one, and it's certainly not conceived like one. And that's why art historians like me, or not like me actually, have completely ignored the Shroud of Turin over the course of the last century. It just doesn't fit into the history of art.
So that's Dr. Thomas de Wesselo, right? And again, he is a medieval art historian, and he's not a Christian. He is an agnostic. He doesn't even believe in God. And here he is backing up the Shroud of Turin, saying this doesn't fit a medieval artwork. It doesn't fit the artwork that we have from the medieval period. And you can see, here's another burial shroud depicting images. This is actually the Shroud of Besancon, which dates 100 years after the 1300s. And it's nothing like the realistic portrait of the shroud. But yet people in the medieval period believed this was the real burial shroud. So like Thomas de Wessel said, people were gullible. You didn't need to create realistic shroud images. So it just doesn't fit medieval European art. If I can get back to my slides.
So Dale, so that's the argument. That's the premise that he's making now. If a person were to make a forgery of the shroud, this is not what they would do. this is more advanced than the culture would accept.
Exactly. Yeah. It makes no sense given all other medieval artworks, including other shrouds that we have with images made, late at that time. It doesn't fit uh, European artwork of the 1300s at all. So, and he's written an entire book giving that argument. So, okay, great. So if it doesn't fit the 1350s, um, great. We know that it did belong to this Geoffrey de Charny, but how did he get it? Where did he get the shroud from then? If it goes back further, where did it come from? And unfortunately, we just have to be honest. The answer is we don't know, because the only information we get is from his son writing about 40 years later, saying that his father got the Shroud of Turin as a gift freely given or generously presented to him, meaning he didn't buy it for money. And that's literally all we know. We don't know who gave it to him. We don't know where or how he got it. So there's a bit of a mystery there. But on the pro shroud side, we can understand where the shroud was as of 1204, and that's in Constantinople. We have at least a few texts that I think mention the Shroud of Turin being in Constantinople as of 1204. And the main one that you'll note is a French crusader named Robert de Clary. He was a French soldier that was fighting in the Fourth Crusade and helped to sack the city of Constantinople when largely French knights, stole treasures and relics from the city and brought it back to France. Now, he gives us something just before they attacked the city. Robert de Clary mentions this, and he says he saw something, quote unquote, and there was another church which was called My Lady Saint Mary of Blanchet, where there was the syndoin, which means shroud in Greek, in which our Lord had been wrapped, which every Friday they rose upright so that one could see the images of our Lord upon it. And none of the ordinary soldiers, either Greek or French, ever knew what became of the shroud when the city was taken. So it looks like this is an imaged burial shroud of Jesus that they would show in Constantinople. The pro shroud side says, well, this is obviously speaking about the Shroud of Turin, and somehow it got lost or was maybe taken by a French crusader and they lost track of it. And one way or another, it ended up in France in the hands of Geoffrey de Charny in the 1350s. And in terms of how it got there, like I said, it is a bit of a gap in our knowledge. That on the pro shroud side, there are at least 17 theories as to how the shroud got from 1204 Constantinople to Geoffrey in France in the 1350s. But I'm not going to go over all of that, but just understand that is a bit of a historical gap in our knowledge, but we can at least trace it back, I would say, to 1204 Constantinople. Great. So if it was in Constantinople in 1204, how did it get from Jerusalem in 30 AD to Constantinople at that time? And on that front, there are two main proposals for a history on the shroud. And both of these theories are based on the Byzantine Archaeopoeta traditions. Archaeopoeta just means they were cloths with images not made by human hands. So that there were certain cloths that the Byzantines believed were miraculous. They were formed by God. They weren't images that were created with human hands. And the first of these theories is called the image of Edessa theory. So this is the most popular theory in pro-shroud circles by a guy named Ian Wilson. And it basically says, well, look, for the first 500 years, there's a legend called the King Abgar legend, whereby this guy, King Abgar of Edessa, heard about Jesus doing his miracles, and he wanted a miracle healing for himself. So he sent a letter to Jesus begging him to come to his kingdom and heal him. Well, this was during the Passion Week. So Jesus said, look, I'm busy getting killed this week. I can't come, but I will send one of my disciples after my resurrection, and they will heal you and they'll help you. Okay, so he dies, and then lo and behold, the disciple Adai or Thaddeus went to Edessa, and he brought the burial shroud with him and showed that to the king, upon which he was healed and converted to Christianity. And Edessa was the first Christian kingdom in human history. So goes the legend. But one of his sons, when he overtook the throne, he was a pagan and he hated the Christians. So he he reverted the kingdom back to paganism and started killing and persecuting all the Christians. And it was during this time that they hid the shroud. One of the Christians hid the shroud in the Edessan walls, and it was lost and forgotten about for 500 years, until there was a flood in the 540s. And at that time, they rediscovered the shroud, and they called it the image of Edessa. It was this miraculous image that was truly the burial shroud of Christ. And, they kept it in Edessa for the next few centuries until 944 AD, when the Byzantines conquered Edessa, and they brought the image of Edessa, or the shroud, with them back to Constantinople, where it stayed until 1204. So that's the image of Edessa theory. Does that make sense to everyone what that theory is?
It makes sense, but it sounds weird.
It sounds weird. Oh, what sounds weird about it, if you don't mind me asking?
We're talking about is this the same time period you're saying that a king was healed by looking at the shroud?
Yeah.
I think that's what seems weird about it. It makes it seem more like a fairy tale.
So believe it or not, I actually fully agree with you. The Abgar legend is very poorly attested to. So this is one of the criticisms of this theory. And secular historians will say, well, Edessa was the first Christian kingdom, but it wasn't King Abgar V at the time of Jesus. It was actually King Abgar VIII, and he lived during the time of the Emperor Commodus, from the bad emperor from the movie Gladiator. So that's 190 years or 180 years after Jesus. So yeah, so that's a major problem. You're right with this theory. And that's why I myself reject this hypothesis. I go for the second theory, which is the image of God incarnate hypothesis by my friend Jack Marquardt. And he says, look, where the shroud is in the first century, it was brought to Antioch, which is much more likely because that was the Christian capital at that time. And it was kept hidden due to this thing called the discipline of the secret. So Christians were being persecuted by pagans, Jews, and even later on, fellow Christians and that sort of thing, right? Because there is at least 3 different types of Christians in Antioch, including heretics like Arians and stuff like that. So they had to keep the shroud secret. They didn't show it publicly and that sort of thing. And that's why there's really no mention of the shroud for the first 500 years. And at some point, it wasn't until 574, so again, in the 6th century, that the shroud was kind of rediscovered publicly, and it became known as the image of God incarnate. And from there, it was taken directly to Constantinople, where it sat in a golden reliquary or golden box until the 1204 crusade that took place there. So that's the image of God incarnate hypothesis. Is that making sense there?
Makes more sense than the number 8.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. All right, cool. So those are the theories. Now, do we have any actual evidence proving that the shroud actually dates back prior to 1204, beyond the medieval period? And on that front, we have various evidences. So I just want to highlight some of the main ones. So the first main argument pro-shroud guys give is an argument from art history. So this comes from people like that agnostic, Dr. Thomas de Westlow, who's written this entire book, right? And it's the argument from art history. And it says, look, for the first 500 years, the depictions of Jesus, nobody had a clue what he looked like. You'll see the Syriac style. Most images of Jesus have him in the Greco-Roman style with short hair, clean shaven. Nobody really knew what Jesus looked like. They didn't have an official way to portray him. But right in the 6th century, something very weird happened. And this is undeniable. All historians acknowledge this, that for some reason in the 540s, in and around that range, Christians universally recognized the standard traditional depiction of Jesus, long hair, parted in the middle, a long beard and mustache, the Christ Pantocrator type image of Jesus that we all take for granted today. So historians have said, well, this is a puzzle. What would have caused the Christians to all of a sudden at this time all agree this is the official way Jesus looked? And pro-Shroud historians say, it's because at this time they rediscovered the Shroud of Turin, and the Shroud went public at this time. And this is why the Byzantines started basing their artistic depictions of Jesus based on the image of the Shroud, because it makes sense, right? If they discover the burial shroud, what they believe to be the burial shroud of Jesus, it has images on it. They're going to say, well, these are the official, this is what Jesus really looked like. So we're going to change our art to reflect the Shroud images. And this is an argument. So you can see it kind of started with the Vinian markings, right? Now, I'm not going to go over all of these, but here are some artistic Byzantine icons, all dating from the 6th century up to the 1200s AD. And there are certain weird features. For example, there's a 3-sided square between the eyes that's on some of these pictures, and that just happens to be on the Shroud. I wish my mouse wasn't frozen, but there's like a V at the bridge of the nose. They start depicting Jesus with kind of larger eyes. And there's a reason for that. Some people think they're on the Shroud Man, there's coins over top of the eyes, and that makes them look to the naked eye like they're big and wide. There's a raised eyebrow. There's a swollen cheek. There's a long beard and with kind of a bifurcated beard, so it looks like the man in the Shroud has part of his beard in the middle plucked out. It's kind of forked. There's an enlarged left nostril. Stuff of this nature, which is unique to the Shroud of Turin and these Byzantine paintings. So that the theory goes, why did they start depicting Jesus in this standardized way? It's because they saw the Shroud images, and the Shroud images had these unique features on them. So that's the Vinian markings. But beyond that, I think the best image on this front is called the Hungarian Prayer Codex. And this is a codex that depicts so here's the anointing scene with Jesus. So just like with the Shroud, he has his right arm over top of his left. He has 4 elongated fingers, no thumbs, which are visible. And that's something, that's pretty unique, because on the Shroud Man, the thumbs are contracted. You can't see the thumbs. And doctors have determined that's because of how the nails in the cross, when it goes through your wrist, it would force the thumb to retract and go inside. He's also got, it's kind of hard to see here, but he's got a wound on the forehead that kind of looks like what's called the epsilon. There's a reverse 3 shaped blood flow on the Shroud Man, and that seems to be depicted here, if you could go closer up. And another feature here that's really weird is that Jesus is totally naked. Now, you might say, well, I've seen Jesus naked in lots of paintings. There's no big deal. Well, if you go to this, when this manuscript was made, that's totally unprecedented. You would never dare to show Jesus naked. The only exceptions are at his baptism. And even there, they try to obscure his manhood, with water or something like that. They would never depict Jesus in this resurrection or crucifixion scene totally naked. So why did they do that here? Well, it's because they're looking at the Shroud Man, and the Shroud Man is naked. On the bottom image, oops, so this thing's kind of blocked. Well, you guys don't see the bar anyways. So, okay, so this is meant to be this is after the resurrection, and the three Marys come to the tomb, and the angel is speaking to the three Marys. That's what the scene is here. And this is meant to be the shroud cloth on the pro shroud side. So you can see the fold at the left end there. And there's even the distinctive herringbone weave pattern depicted of this cloth, which is unique to the Shroud of Turin. And on that basis, even textile expert Dr. Methchal Fleury-Lemberg agrees that whoever painted this must have seen the shroud, because she says it's just not possible to depict this unique weave. But by far, I think the best argument here comes from something that's very odd, and skeptics can't explain it. There's a series of holes that look like an L. Here's a close-up of that, right? So these four holes just randomly on this cloth. Why is that? Well, it's because the shroud has these L-shaped poker holes on it, which are distinctive of that cloth. And it's in the same position and same relative size and stuff like that, shape and size, as what's depicted here. So it looks like the shroud must have existed at the time this manuscript was painted, at least a couple centuries before the medieval period, and the artist was copying it. So this is the first major category of evidence from art history. Any questions about that, or does that make sense?
One question, Brother Dale. Most artists, as you call them, use their own interpretation. So what you're saying makes sense to a certain degree, but I'm just wondering if the artist was interpreting what he thought was the shroud picture and not the real deal.
Yeah, so yeah, he definitely. I think the only reason why he would depict some of these features is because he was looking at the shroud and he believed that was the authentic burial cloth, and that's why it was authoritative to him. Now, to your point, I'm just presenting a simple pro case here, but we have to be honest that there are some disanalogies. So, for example, one of the main things that a shroud skeptic will say against this argument is they'll say, well, look at the shroud man's beard. It's a short beard. Well, the shroud man has a long beard, right? So that's totally disanalogous. So that's kind of just one example of an argument against the pro shroud side. And the pro shroud people will say what you said, that, well, artists have different interpretations. Maybe for some reason he focused on certain features, but he wanted to depict Jesus with a short beard as a matter of interpretation. So that's kind of the comeback there. But yeah, we have to be honest. There are some disanalogies here too. Yep.
Thank you.
No problem.
So Dale,
yep.
as I will always do, is to go to say, why are you showing this, so they can understand. So you're using this argument to say the shroud had to be real because there were depictions drawn of the shroud and it had to be based on the actual shroud. Is that the argument?
Exactly. We have various artworks dating from the 500s through the 1200s, right? That display unique features that are unique to the shroud, the man on the shroud. Therefore, yeah, they must have been copying it. And if that's true, then the shroud must date far earlier than the medieval period. At the very latest, the 500s AD, it was there. So does that make sense? Yep.
Yep.
All right, cool. Now, and here's just a list of all the experts. And here's the agnostic, Dr. Thomas de Westlo, but all the experts who've looked at this Hungarian Codex, and the vast majority of them have determined that the shroud was indeed used and copied from to make these images. And this includes skeptics, right? So you have Andrea Nicolati. He's probably the only one who says no, he thinks there's a 0 to 5% chance that the shroud was used to make these images, whereas DeWeslow, as an agnostic, says no, there's a 95 to 100% chance. So the point here is that the scholarly consensus from qualified art historians is that yes, whoever painted these images copied the shroud, meaning the shroud must predate the medieval period. So hopefully that's making sense.
So, Dale, a guy like that, Nicolati, is his name Nicolati?
Yep.
What would be his argument to say, okay, no, these pictures are not depictions from the actual shroud? What would he say?
Yes.
Or the guy who's 50% there, Montezano?
Yep. The agnostic. Okay. Yeah. So his real name Heimberger, but so one of the points that they would make was the point about the beard and that sort of thing, right? Another major disanalogy is, well, the Shroud Man, remember I mentioned he's full of scourge wounds, right? Where the heck are all the scourge wounds on the body? There's none depicted. So that's another thing that they'll say that disqualifies this argument. The other thing doesn't come from so much from Nicolati, although he argues it as well. But I think Hugh Ferry has done the most work, and that he's looked at other images depicting these same scenes, and they'll say that, well, this thing down here, this isn't the shroud cloth. It's not a cloth at all. It's the tomb, because they depicted tombs as sarcophaguses. So this upper portion here is, if my mouse would work, this is the lid of the tomb askew, and this is the side of the tomb, the sepulcher, and it's empty, right? And they'll say, well, look at this crumpled up mess here. This is what the shroud is, kind of thing. So that's what the skeptics would argue, kind of thing, and give those counterpoints. So you have to kind of assess what do you think's more probable. On that front, when it comes to the L-shaped poker holes, the strongest feature that convinces most art historians, I've asked directly the Shroud skeptics. They don't have any convincing answer. They admit it serves no decorative or functional purpose. They just don't. They can't explain it. They don't know. So that's by far the most persuasive on the pro Shroud side. Is that helpful?
I'm just trying to remember, when you said the shroud went into hiding in 540 in Antioch, and then was seen again in 1500 or 1300.
In the 500s is when it was rediscovered. So in Antioch, they had an earthquake, and that rediscovered it in the church and that sort of thing after the earthquake, and that was around 574 AD.
And you said before that the shroud wouldn't decompose in a previous thing.
So no, it has decomposed to some extent, but the quality of the shroud is remarkable. Like it's nowhere near as brittle or decomposed as it should be. Even if it's a medieval thing from the 1350s, it's still in too good condition. So that's an indicator that there's a miracle going on, or something weird is going on with the cloth. All right.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, so the next argument is pretty much exactly the same as the one from art history, but this one is actually based on coins, right? So images of Jesus' face, again, dating from the 6th century up to the 1200s, show unique features of the shroud that are unique to the Shroud Man. And so, for example, you can see these are some bronze coins that date to the year 1028 AD. And they have certain features that are uniquely seen on the Shroud Man's face. And believe it or not, a coin expert, Justin Robinson, I've had him on my show, and he's a fellow from the Royal and British Numismatic Societies. Numismatic just means coins. It's a fancy word for coins. And he's published in a peer review
for the Friday, but I'm not getting involved.
Okay. And he's published in probably the most prestigious coins peer-reviewed journal in the world. I think it's called Coin News, um, establishing this link, and it was published in peer review. So this is a credible argument taken seriously by secular coin experts. What's more, there are also what are called the Justinian gold solidus coins. These date back to 692 AD. So that's about 60 years after the Prophet Muhammad died. And there are certain features that have been analyzed by a scientist called Dr. Giulio Fonte. And so you can see there's certain blood stains and stuff that are depicted on the coin that match the blood flows on the shroud. As well, it also has those Vinian markings and stuff like that, swollen cheek and that sort of thing. And he's calculated it statistically that there's a one chance in 10 billion that the person who made this coin didn't see the shroud. So in other words, it's like 99.9999999. Keep going with the nines for an hour, but percent chance that whoever made this coin was copying the shroud images when he made it and depicted these features. So that's a statistical argument that Giulio Fonte has made and argued for. So that's kind of the argument from the coins, those two coins there. Once again, if the shroud was used to make these coins, and these coins date to 692 AD, that means the shroud dates at least from that period or earlier. So is that making sense to everybody? Any questions or?
Yeah, a good question would be, Dale. So these people who are making paintings of the shroud and making images on coins of the shroud, these people would believe that this was a shroud of Jesus. They wouldn't think it as some random person.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's the only reason why on earth would you depict these weird markings and stuff like that for no reason. It's only because you would only put these weird marks on if you believe the image you're copying is an authoritative one, that this is from the real burial cloth of Jesus. So yeah, I'll put that. Otherwise, there's no functional purpose to put these kind of tufts in it. All right.
And Dale, just to add on, so we're also saying that the shroud that we have and that we're looking at would be the same shroud that they would have saw themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Because this is on the right hand side. This is the shroud that we have today. It has these blood stains in it. And what are the odds this coin from 692 AD also has certain markings that correspond to these blood flows? That's according to Giulio Fonte, that's statistically impossible unless they were looking at the shroud and copying it, kind of thing. So that's that argument. Here's one that I think is really great. So somebody asked last week about the head cloth being separate. Well, here it is. It's called the Sudarium of Oviedo. And as you can see, so it's a cloth that would have covered the head, and it has certain blood stains and body fluids on it. There are no images on this cloth. It's just the blood stains and the body fluids. And this is a cloth, it has a known history. We can trace this back. The first historical document mentioning it is from the 5th century AD, so the 400s AD, and it's in Jerusalem, and it says, look, here's the head cloth of Jesus Christ that is held in the monastery of Mark, I believe the source says, going back, and it covered our Lord and Savior. And it has a known history from there, being taken from Jerusalem, trying to escape first the Persians, and then later on the Muslim conquerors, and it fled westward until it arrived in Oviedo, Spain in 711 AD, and it's been there ever since. So this cloth has a known history going back to Jerusalem specifically, and it's purported in the 5th century that it goes back to the 1st century and covered Jesus. Now, here's the amazing thing, because many forensic experts have studied these blood stains and body fluids, and they've linked it to the bloodstains and body fluids on the Shroud of Turin. So they're both, and there are anatomical features. From the stains, they can tell how big the nose was, the mouth, and that sort of thing, and they all match. And even the crown of thorns on the back of the head matches with what's on the Shroud of Turin. And I'm just going to play a short 5-minute clip, and that'll be the last one for video clips. But this is Dr. Mark Guskin. He's an expert in the Sudarium, and he'll give you a visual representation of the connection there. So let me just show that if I can. Okay.
With new forensic evidence that places the shroud yet further back in time. It is something known as the Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain. It is reputed to be the face cloth mentioned in the Gospel of John. John says that the disciples entered the tomb of Jesus on the 3rd day after his death, only to find it empty, apart from the burial cloth and the face cloth. We also know from official records in Oviedo that the Sudarium can be accurately dated to the 5th century AD. I've invited to Turin Mark Guskin, an expert on the Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain. His evidence could push the date of the Turin shroud back another 700 years to the 5th century. This is an identical copy of the Sudarium. Its purpose was to trap blood escaping from the corpse as it was taken away for burial. Guskin believes he's identified significant evidence linking the Sudarium to the Shroud of Turin. Guskin already knew that the shroud has real blood. It belongs to the rare group AB. There are also traces of blood shed in life and blood shed in death. And finally, there are the unmistakable traces of blood from a crown of thorns on the front of the head and the back. Guskin believes all 3 blood features can be found on the Sudarium.
The first is the blood group, which is a relatively rare blood group on the planet. It's the blood group AB, and it's the same blood group of human blood on both cloths. Then there's also the differentiation between life blood, in other words, blood shed in life, and post-mortem blood, which can be clearly differentiated. And again, that coincides on both cloths. And that brings us to what, for me, clinches the whole matter of the cloths being used on the same body. Now, this was blood shed in life, while the man in question was still alive. Now, this blood comes from wounds that were made by some kind of sharp object piercing the skin in this area of the nape of the neck. Perfectly compatible with what has been called since then a crown of thorns. Now, if we look at this, we have exactly the same stains in the same area on the Shroud of Turin. Now, the actual shape of the stains, if you do an overlay of the two, well, the actual shape, the way the blood flowed coincides on both cloths.
So what you're saying is not only the blood types that are the same, the actual patterns of the blood on both cloths can be matched.
That's right. That's exactly so.
Amazing.
Which has led more than one qualified forensic doctor to say that the only conclusion you can make from that is that both cloths were used on the same body. In other words, this is too much for a simple coincidence.
So let me understand, what you're saying is that the fact that we know exactly what happened to the Sudarium in its history has huge implications for the shroud, because obviously they both covered the same man.
That's right. And the only place that they could have coincided in time was in Jerusalem, sometime before the 4th or the 5th century. There's no two ways about that. They couldn't have coincided at any given time after that.
Because we know what happened.
That's exactly where the Sudarium was all the time.
These very distinctive wounds on the back of the head on the shroud link it to the Sudarium in Jerusalem before 500 AD.
All right. So does that make sense in terms of this argument? I saw a few of you nodding your heads and stuff. Any questions about the evidence from the Sudarium and stuff?
Well, Dale, why don't you just give them a little quick summation of what he's saying?
Yeah, so he's saying there's a number of commonalities that can't be explained due to coincidence alone that link the Sudarium and the shroud cloth. So number one, both the Shroud and the Sudarium are alleged to have blood type AB. So that links both cloths. Also, he says that there's a difference between post-mortem and pre-mortem blood flows, and those match on both cloths. And finally, the blood stains, when you do an overlay, you put, the image of one blood stain over top of the other one, there are blood flows that match precisely, and that links the two cloths together. So that's what he was doing when he showed those two cloths. So once again, since we know the Sudarium dates back at the latest to the 5th century in Jerusalem, that means we know that the Shroud, whoever the Sudarium covered, the Shroud covered that same corpse. So that means the Shroud was at the latest 5th century in Jerusalem or earlier type thing. So I'm pushing you back slowly but surely, right? So is that making sense to everybody? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
There would be different wounds in the body as compared to the head, right? Like the scourge wounds and the nail piercing, his heart, and that is as for the crown of thorns,
So the body is totally irrelevant because the Sudarium only covered the head. So we can't compare because the Sudarium never covered the body of Jesus. It was just covering his head. So yeah, we're comparing the shroud face, the back and front of the head of the Shroud man to the Sudarium of Oviedo, and that's where the matches are. Yeah, because there's no body on the Sudarium at all. Right? It's a head cloth. Okay. All right, cool. Any other questions? We're good to go. All right. Okay, great. So look, I've pushed you guys back to the 5th century at the latest, but Dale, do you have anything that actually dates the Shroud to the 1st century during the time of Jesus? You betcha. So we actually have a total of 5 scientific dating tests, all proving that the Shroud dates to the 1st century AD. So the first test that was done was a microchemical test by a chemist, Dr. Raymond Rogers. He was one of the scientists on the STIRP team back in 1978. Oh, sorry. Okay. And I'm not going to get into the details. I don't want to get too technical again, but essentially, as I said, a linen cloth will degrade over time and in certain specific ways that are chemically identifiable. And in this case, Ray Rogers conducted a study of the Shroud's vanillin and determined that the amount left is comparable to that found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know for a fact the Dead Sea Scrolls date to the time of Jesus, the 1st century, at the latest 70 AD or 73 AD, or earlier type deal. So this links the Shroud to the 1st century in this chemical way. And this was published in the Thermochemica Acta Science Peer Review Journal in 2005. And I give the link there if you want to read it for free. So this is, again, one of those most prestigious secular science journals. This isn't a religious puff piece or something like that published his conclusion that the Shroud is 1st century based on the chemical evidence from the vanillin. In addition to that, we have a total of 4 physical dating tests proving the Shroud dates to the 1st century, but not only that, with a 95% degree of certainty, which is incredible. So Giulio Fonte has done an FTIR, or Fourier transform infrared dating test. He used Raman spectroscopy. He also did a mechanical tensile strength test, so where he twisted the fibers to see how strong or flexible they are and stuff like that. And just recently in the peer-reviewed journal Heritage, in 2022, he did an X-ray or a wide-angle X-ray dating test based on the depolymerization of the cellulose of the Shroud. So again, no technical details, but the point is there are certain ways that the linen cloth will degrade over time and these dating techniques are able to pick up on that and assign a date. And here's a helpful visual thing of the results on the bottom thing of the. So here's for the four things you can see, and obviously for any dating method, there's going to be plus and minuses. So that's why it's like that circle, right? Right. So it's 400 AD plus or minus 400 years for one of it. The other Raman spectroscopy got a date of 200 BC plus or minus 500 years. And Giulio Font, he's being extra liberal with his error bars here, just to err on the side of caution. To, maybe my method's erroneous. At most, it could be off by 500 years. But guess what? He found the only century that overlaps all of these methods, all four of these dating techniques, you guessed it, the 1st century AD. That's the only century that all of these dating techniques overlap, meaning that's what gives us and here's just the peer-reviewed journal on the X-ray dating of the Shroud. So all of these date the Shroud to the 1st century, the time of Jesus, which I think's incredible. So any questions about that or? No?
This thing here, the blue is ones that were wrong, and the red is the one that was right. Right?
You're talking about this thing on the screen right now?
Yeah.
So the red, where's my mouse? The red thing. So we're going to talk more about, I've been trying to avoid this, but we're going to be talking about this next week because there is another scientific dating test, namely a carbon-14 test, which dates the Shroud to the medieval period, the 1350s. So we're going to be addressing that next week when we look at refuting the skeptics and stuff, right? But just for now, think about it, right? So there are a total of 5 scientific dating tests that date the Shroud to the 1st century. There's only one scientific dating test that dates the Shroud to the medieval period. I think it's obvious where the weight should be. So, yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Now, great. So you've got it to the 1st century, but how do you link it to Jesus specifically? Maybe it's just some random corpse, a guy in the first, maybe it's the Shroud of Barabbas or something like that, right? Well, there are a few lines of evidence on this front, but since this is a Bible study, I wanted to suggest to you guys that perhaps there are actually references in the New Testament, not just to the burial shroud in general, but to shroud images that we see. And the only thing we have would be the Shroud of Turin. So the biblical scholar Larry Stolley has actually argued he's just publishing a book in an academic, by an academic publisher, Jenny Sanford there. And he says there are at least several references in the New Testament that he believes are enigmatic or cryptic mentions of the shroud images in the New Testament pages themselves. And the reason, why are they cryptic? Why don't they just come out and tell us, like what John Calvin was saying and arguing against the shroud? Again, that discipline of the secret, that they were being persecuted. If the pagans or the Jews found out that they had a shroud with apparently miraculous images on it, they would try to destroy it, right? So that's why they had to keep it secret in those initial centuries and that sort of thing. And that's why they referred to it cryptically in the New Testament. Now, what are some of the examples? So I'm not going to go over, just for time's sake, I'll go over one, but I've listed 3 here, right? So Matthew 12, chapter 12, verses 38 to 42 mentions this sign of Jonah. And this is a puzzle in New Testament scholarship, as he argues that's a reference to the shroud, and he gives his arguments. Or Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 to 12 uses the typology of the tabernacle. Larry tries to argue, well, that's referring to the shroud when he goes through the shroud cloth and becomes resurrected. But probably the one that is the best of these and the least controversial is Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. And I just want to go over that one. Because this is the one that has me perhaps leaning towards this argument. So Galatians 3:1 says, look, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your very eyes that Jesus Christ was clearly, publicly portrayed as crucified. Okay, so what is it they're seeing? How are they seeing Jesus Christ crucified in public with their own eyes? These are Galatians, they're pagans. They weren't in Jerusalem back in 30 AD. None of these guys saw Jesus actually crucified. So what Larry argues is that they must have seen the shroud images. Now, why haven't biblical scholars found these cryptic references before? Well, the main interpretation is they'll say, look, this isn't the shroud. They're not seeing anything literally. The way to interpret this is metaphorically. Paul, his preaching was so vivid that it put the mental picture of Jesus crucified in their heads. That's what Galatians 3:1 is talking about. It's not about a literal shroud and seeing a crucified crucified image on a burial shroud. So that's been traditionally the mainstream, and even to this day, is still the mainstream understanding of this text. Now, here's the problem. The Greek verb used here, and Reverend Sully, you can probably help me out with this. It's prographo.
Yeah. Prographo. So, yeah, prographos.
Perfect. This means to publicly portray. It's the same Greek word that's used for when they would put an official notice or an edict in the public square for everyone to see literally with their eyes and read. And everywhere this word is used, it's always, whether the New Testament or outside literature, it's always used for something they're literally seeing with their eyeballs directly. And I have a quote from biblical scholar Dr. If I can move this, Dr. Basil Davis, who says, quote unquote, the failure of attempts to find a literal, why is the mainstream view the metaphorical understanding here? Well, Basil Davis says, well, it's only because of the failure of attempts to find a literal a literal context for the, I wish I could move this, for the visual language of 3:1, which has led to this dominant metaphorical view. The visual language is to be understood metaphorically, even though the verb is never attested in this sense anywhere else within or outside of Scripture. A visual, literal object is always associated with this Greek verb elsewhere. So this is one of Basil Davis in the secular biblical scholarship, right? So that's the only reason they do it. But here if we insert the shroud, it all makes perfect sense. The shroud depicts the crucified corpse of Jesus. It's got the nail wounds in his feet and wrists, all of his scourge wounds and that sort of thing. So if you posit that maybe the Galatians are seeing the shroud images, I think it makes perfect sense. And guess what? Even biblical scholar Ben Witherington III, I had him on my show debating Larry Stolley on this topic. And even he admitted, in his commentary, he took the traditional view of the metaphorical interpretation. And he admitted on the show, Larry, you're right. I was wrong. This can't be metaphorical. This is speaking to something literal that they were seeing. Somehow with their own eyes, they literally saw Jesus Christ publicly portrayed as crucified.
And just to add to this,
Yep.
Ben Witherington is a New Testament scholar, and he's a Wesleyan of all Wesleyan scholars.
Yes. Yep. I didn't know that until you told me, but yeah, he's a Wesleyan. He's of the same denomination there, and he's one of the foremost biblical scholars in the world. And guess what? Even though he disagrees with Larry on these biblical mentions, he's pro-shroud in general. He believes the shroud is authentic and is miraculous proof of Christ's resurrection. So, yeah. Any questions about that, or are you guys good?
Mhm.
Okay. All right, cool. So in conclusion, look, there are many other categories of evidences that just due to time's sake, I had to leave out. There's literally one of the scholars, Joe Marino, has counted up the number of academic disciplines involved in studying the Shroud. He got a list of over 106 academic disciplines involved in studying the Shroud. So, there are all other studies. There have been studies on the pollen on the Shroud, and the limestone dust on the tip of the nose and the knees and the feet, which link it to Jerusalem. There's a whole host of evidence related to the Shroud as a textile, which I just haven't mentioned at all. But again, they link it, I would argue, to the 1st century, to the time of Jesus. There are many historical arguments and stuff like that related to the depiction of the Shroud Man and its accurate portrayal of a 1st century Roman scourging and crucifixion, which would have been impossible for someone in the medieval period to get those details right. Just one example, the Shroud Man is crucified through the wrists, not through the palms of the hands. The medievals didn't understand that. They always depicted Jesus crucified through the palms, not through the wrists. So that's an example of a historical accuracy. But in closing, just to conclude, I want to quote, how do we know this covered the historical Jesus in 30 AD? Given all the evidence we have, I want to quote Dr. Robert Buckland. He's another scientist, a medical expert, a forensic pathologist who studied the Shroud with Stirp in 1978. Again, he believes it's authentic and all that. And in fact, he's so famous. The show from the 70s, Quincy, medical expert, or Quincy ME, the TV show, that was based on him. That show was inspired on him. And here's what he says about the Shroud. Quote unquote, in the case of the man on the Shroud, the forensic pathologist will have information relative to the circumstances of death by crucifixion, which he can support by his anatomical findings. He will be aware of that the hang on, let me move this. That the individual whose image is depicted on the cloth has undergone puncture injuries to his wrists and feet, puncture injuries to his head, multiple traumatic whip-like injuries to his back, and post-mortem puncture injury to his chest area, which has released both blood and a watertight fluid. From this data, along with all the other historical evidence, it is not an unreasonable conclusion to determine that the only one person historically who has undergone this sequence of events, and that person is Jesus Christ. So yeah, I agree with Dr. Robert Buckland in terms of his conclusion. So that's it for today in terms of establishing the historical case. But look, like I said, so far in this series, we've only looked at one side of the equation, the positive evidence in favor of the Shroud of Turin's authenticity. In the last class, I want to look at least 3 to 4 of the main Shroud skeptics' arguments and provide a refutation or a counter to those, because there is evidence on the other side that you can't ignore. You have to address it. So that's what we will do next time. And thank you very much for listening.
Great. Thank you, Dale. I think you could stop the recording.
Okay. Where's my mouse? All right. So stop sharing and then stop recording.